The first Panther still has its gun trained east, exactly where the commander pointed it in the last second of his life. The second sits 40 meters behind, hull split along the glacis seam, road wheels scattered into the beat rows. The third never finished its turn. All three burned in a shallow field outside Leh, in the Lorraine, in September of 1944, and the German recovery crews who came for them measured the distance between wrecks and did the arithmetic. 90 seconds. That was the interval, wreck to wreck, based on where the tank stopped and how far a Panther moves at cruising speed on soft ground. 3 of the best medium tanks in the world, 68 tons of engineering between them, dead before the lead crew could even report contact. Here is the part that should not be possible. A Panther's frontal armor could shrug off almost anything the American Army fielded that autumn, and the crews knew it. They had built their entire tactical confidence on that fact. Yet something out in that beat field was killing them faster than a loader could seat a round, faster than a commander could shout a range and a direction. That is the puzzle this whole story turns on. And if you enjoy watching a documented mystery get taken apart piece by piece, do me a favor. Like this video, subscribe, and leave your best theory in the comments before I show you the answer. I read everyone, and the sharpest arguments on this channel come straight out of that comment section. Now, back to the field. The Germans had a word for what they feared out there, and it was not a word they used lightly. Panzerschreck, tank fright, tank terror, normally describe the infantryman's dread of armor, but by late 1944, the roles had begun to invert in strange pockets of the Western Front. American after-action reports from the Lorraine campaign are dry, clipped documents, the kind of paperwork that records a burning enemy column, the way a clerk records a shipment. One of them notes the destruction of a Panther platoon near Arracourt in a single line and moves on to the next grid reference. That flatness is the tell. Whatever did this had become routine enough that the men doing it no longer thought it remarkable. What could kill a Panther faster than its crew could react? Not a bigger gun, necessarily. Not thicker armor. The Panther already had the better cannon and the better protection in most head-on comparisons with what rolled off American assembly lines. A Sherman 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate a Panther's front plate at any sane battlefield range, and every German tanker had been briefed on exactly that. So the men in those 3 burning hulls near Leh were not killed by a weapon that beat them on paper. They were killed by something that refused to fight the duel they had trained for. Something that arrived from a direction the doctrine did not account for. On a timeline, the doctrine could not survive. The survivors, and there were survivors, tankers who bailed out with their coveralls smoking and lived to be interrogated after the war, kept describing the same sequence. The lead tank stops, then the second and the third behind it. No visible enemy armor. No muzzle flash from the tree line where a hidden tank would sit. By the time the 4th commander in the column understood what he was looking at, his best decision was not to advance or maneuver or seek cover forward. It was to throw the transmission into reverse and get the whole column moving backward, away from the beat field, before the 90-second clock started again. German tank commanders, the professionals, the men who wrote the book on armored aggression, began ordering their columns to retreat from an enemy they often could not even see. The paint told the story before the tanks did. Panzer-Brigade 11-3 rolled into the Lorraine in September of 1944, with factory finish still bright on the glacis plates, no mud caked in the road wheels, no scorch marks around the exhaust louvers. These were new machines, and worse, new crews. The brigade had been stood up in a hurry that summer, part of a scheme to conjure fresh armored formations out of the wreckage of the Eastern Front, and somebody in the planning staff had done the math backward. Give the green men the best tank. That was the logic. If the crews were undertrained, compensate with hardware so good it forgave mistakes. On paper, it was almost reasonable. The brigade fielded a full battalion of Panthers, the Ausführung G model, 90-plus tanks at authorized strength, which in the autumn of 1944 made it richer in armor than most divisions could dream of. The frontal plate ran 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees, which multiplied its effective resistance to something no American medium gun could crack head-on. The long 75mm KWK-42 could punch through a Sherman's front at 2,000 meters and keep going. Every specification pointed the same direction. In a straight fight, nose to nose, the Panther won. So the crews were taught to think in exactly those terms. Point the thick plate at the enemy. Advance. Trust the armor. Reversing was not in the vocabulary. A Panther that backed up exposed its thinner flanks and its vulnerable rear, where the armor dropped to 40 millimeters and the engine deck sat open to plunging fire. Doctrine said the answer to contact was to face it and shoot through it, because the tank was built to survive the exchange. For the veterans of the East, men who had learned their trade against T-34s, this was gospel that had kept them alive. The trouble was that Panzer-Brigade 11-3 had very few of those veterans. What it had were teenagers and transferred Luftwaffe ground personnel and men pulled from disbanded units, given a fast course in a complicated machine, and pointed west. The Panther was not a forgiving tank to learn on. Its final drives failed under hard steering. Its interleaved road wheels packed with mud and froze. It drank fuel the brigade did not reliably have. A crew needed months to fight it well, and these crews had weeks. This is where the arithmetic that looked reasonable on paper began to curdle. The brigade was ordered into a counterattack around Lunéville and Arracourt, straight into the path of the American 4th Armored Division, a formation that had been fighting continuously across France and knew precisely what it was doing. Fresh tanks, fresh confidence, no experience, driving into veterans. The mismatch was not in the metal. It was in the men behind the optics. The commanders had been promised everything the factory could give them. Superior gun, superior armor, superior optics, and a doctrine that told them the tank in front was the only threat that mattered. They rolled through fog on the mornings of the 19th and 20th of September, believing the thing that would kill them was another tank somewhere ahead that they would see and outshoot. That belief was the flaw the Americans exploited. It was not written in any German manual as a weakness. It read as strength on every page. And so the brigade advanced with its thick plates pointed forward, doing exactly what it had been trained to do, into a killing ground where the direction of the threat and the speed of the threat had both been chosen by someone else. The fog hid what was coming, and the confidence made sure nobody looked hard enough to find it. A German tanker in that column, 19 years old, 4 weeks in the seat, had every reason to believe he was driving the safest machine on the field. He was about to be corrected in 90 seconds. The fog came off the wet ground at first light, thick enough that a driver could lose the tank ahead of him at 30 meters. To the German column, it felt like a gift. Werner Hoffmann, a lieutenant who fought around Arracourt and survived to describe those mornings, remembered the mist as protection, a gray wall that hid the brigade from the artillery spotters and the fighter bombers that had been flaying German armor across France all summer. Move under the fog, close the distance, and the Panther's long gun would do the rest once the air cleared. That was the plan, and it read well in the tent. The Americans wanted that fog too, for different reasons. A German column advancing blind cannot see the low ridgelines. It cannot see the sunken farm tracks where a tank destroyer can sit hull down, with only its gun mantlet showing. Fog does not favor the side with the better optics at 2,000 meters, because at 2,000 meters in fog, there is nothing to see. It favors the side that already knows the ground, that has ranged the crossroads in advance, that lets the enemy drive to a spot marked on a map the enemy has never seen. The mist erased the Panther's single greatest advantage, the reach of that 75, and handed the fight to whoever was waiting at pistol range in the murk. The 4th Armored had been waiting exactly that way. Its crews had pushed across France since Normandy and had learned a habit the manuals never quite captured, which was to let the German come to them and to shoot from the flank at ranges where armor thickness stopped mattering. At 300 meters, at 200, the 80mm glacis plate that no American medium gun could crack head-on was irrelevant because nobody was shooting at the glacis. They were shooting at the side, where 45mm of vertical plate covered the crew compartment and the ammunition racks and the fuel. The 19-year-old in his 4-week-old seat could not have known any of this. He knew what he had been told. Point the thick plate forward, advance, trust the armor, and the fog is your friend. Every instinct the brigade had been issued pointed him deeper into the mist and told him it was safe. The doctrine had no answer for what came next. When the first shot came, it did not come from ahead. It came from the right, from a tree line or a fold in the ground that had been invisible 10 seconds earlier, and it struck a part of the tank the crew had been taught to keep pointed away from the enemy. The problem was that in fog, with an enemy who chose the angle, there was no direction to point that was away from the enemy. The threat was not in front, it was beside and behind, and it moved. A commander who understood that in the first 90 seconds had one card left to play, and it was the card the manual forbade. Throw the whole column into reverse, get the thin flanks out of the enfilade, and the thick plates back between the crew and the guns, even at the cost of exposing the vulnerable rear, while the tank crawled backward through beets and mud. It was an ugly, undignified order, and it went against everything a Panther crew believed about the machine they drove. It was also, in that fog, on that ground, the only order that kept anyone alive. Most of them never got the chance to give it. The reverse command hung over the advance like a word nobody had learned yet, an instinct the brigade would only acquire after the field was full of burning tanks and the recovery crews were pacing off the distance between wrecks. The confidence that carried them into the mist was the same confidence that kept them driving forward when every second forward made it worse, and it was getting worse. The guns that opened up out of the gray were not the guns they had been briefed to fear. The gun that opened up out of the gray belonged to a machine the Germans had never bothered to scout, because nothing in their intelligence picture told them it existed in the way it actually fought. The M18 Hellcat of the American 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion was not a tank. It was built to a different idea entirely, and that idea was the thing German doctrine had no folder for: Start with the number that mattered most. 55 miles per hour. That was the Hellcat's road speed, and it remains the fastest tracked armored fighting vehicle the United States put into mass production in the entire war. Faster than anything the Germans fielded, faster than most of the wheeled trucks hauling their supplies. A Panther, flat out on a good road, made 28. The Hellcat did nearly double that. And it did it because the men who designed it had made a trade so aggressive it looked almost reckless on paper. They stripped the armor. That was the trade. The M18 carried a hull front of half an inch, thickening to an inch on the gun shield. Armor a heavy machine gun could defeat. Armor that stopped rifle rounds and shell splinters and very little else. The turret was open at the top, roofless, so the crew rode exposed to the rain and the artillery airburst and the weather. In exchange for giving all of that away, the designers bought speed and a 9-cylinder Continental radial engine turning a torque-matic transmission, and a 76mm gun that could reach into a Panther's flank and open it like a tin. The doctrine behind it had a name the post-war army would spend years arguing about. Tank Destroyer Doctrine. The idea that you did not use armor to fight armor. You used fast guns that arrived where the enemy tanks were, killed them from ambush, and left before the enemy could react. Shoot and vanish. The M18 was that sentence turned into steel. The rattlesnake it was named for hunts by sensing heat, striking prey in total darkness through pits on its face that read the warmth of a body from a foot away. The Hellcat had no such sense. It made do with speed instead. What it carried was the ability to be somewhere, fire, and be a quarter-mile away and behind a hedgerow before the smoke cleared, and this is precisely what German doctrine could not model. The German tanker had been trained to think about armor duels as a function of two variables, gun and plate. His gunnery tables, his tactical instincts, his entire mental picture of a fight assumed the enemy would sit still long enough to be ranged and answered. The Hellcat refused both halves. It did not sit, and its plate was so thin that penetrating it was never the problem. Finding it was the problem, and by the time you found it, it had already fired and moved. A crewman from the 704th described the feel of it years afterward, and the quote is worth setting down whole. We could get into a position, get our shots off, and be gone before they could traverse that big turret around, one veteran of the battalion recalled. There is the whole lethal arithmetic. A Panther's turret traversed slowly, a hydraulic system geared for precision at long range, not for whipping 90 degrees to answer a threat that had appeared on the flank 3 seconds ago. The Hellcat's crew knew that. They picked their firing positions to sit where the German gun was pointed away, put 2 or 3 rounds into the thin side plate, and used that 55-mile-per-hour reserve to be gone before the traverse motor finished its arc. 3 Panthers, 90 seconds, a shallow beat field outside Leh. The machine that did it was never in the German briefing as a thing that mattered, because on paper, a vehicle that thin was not supposed to be on the battlefield at all. It was supposed to be dead. Instead, it was doing the killing. A map overlay from the 704th's operations file marks the firing positions with small penciled crosses along a low ridge west of Bézange-la-Grande. Look at where the crosses sit, not on the crest, behind it. On the reverse slope, the backside of the rise, where a vehicle sits hidden from anything approaching until the approaching thing climbs to the top and shows its belly. That single choice is the whole ambush. A tank cresting a ridge does something it cannot help doing. For a moment it points its nose at the sky, exposes the thin belly plate and the vulnerable underside of the hull, and blinds its own gunner against the open air, while the men on the far slope already have their sights laid on the exact patch of ground where the silhouette will appear. The German climbing the rise sees nothing until he is over it. The American waiting below sees everything the instant it breaks the skyline. The geometry does the work. All the crew has to do is pull the trigger when the shape arrives on the spot they ranged an hour ago. The positions were chosen for something else too, and it ran against every instinct a gunner is trained to trust: short fields of fire. A gunner wants distance, wants to see the enemy coming from 1,000 meters and take him apart at leisure. The men who sighted these guns wanted the opposite. They put the Hellcats where a Panther would burst into view at 200 meters, sometimes less, close enough that the 76mm round struck the side plate before the German commander had finished registering that a shot had been fired at all. Short range took the Panther's great advantage, that long 75 reaching out to 2,000 meters, and threw it in a ditch. You cannot use reach in a knife fight. And the flank. Every cross on that map was placed to look at a line of advance from the side, never the front. The American who sighted the position walked the ground first and asked a single question: where will the German be pointed when he comes through here? Then he set the gun 90 degrees off that line, so the Panther would present the 45mm side, while its own gun stared uselessly at empty fog to its front. There is one more detail that turns a good ambush into a lethal one. The engines were already running. A Hellcat starting cold takes time, the radial coughing and catching, and time is the one thing a tank destroyer trades its armor away to never spend. So the crews sat in the reverse slope pockets with the Continental idling, transmission warm, the driver's hand on the sticks, the whole vehicle a coiled thing that needed 1 second to fire and 2 more to be moving backward and away. They were not waiting to fight. They were waiting to shoot once and vanish, and the running engine was the difference between vanishing and dying. Picture the trap laid and complete before a single German tank appears. Guns hidden below the crest, ranges already marked on the ground, fields of fire cut short on purpose. Every barrel angled at the flank of a line the enemy has not yet driven down. Engines turning over, warm and ready. Nothing to do now but wait for the fog to deliver the column to the one piece of ground where all of it comes together. The Panthers came on, exactly as the map predicted, because they had nowhere else the road allowed them to go, and no reason to think the low rise ahead was anything but empty French farmland. They climbed toward a skyline that a dozen American gunners had already memorized. The 19-year-old, in his 4th week, put his thick plate forward and drove toward the crest, doing everything right by the only book he had been given. The book was about to be worth nothing at all. Sergeant Louis Kritzberg's driver holds the sticks with the Continental already turning, and when the first Panther's silhouette breaks the crest at 180 meters, the gunner does not wait for an order. He has been staring at that patch of gray for 40 minutes. The 76 fires. The round crosses the beat field in a flat fraction of a second and strikes the Panther low on the right side, just above the second road wheel. Into the plate the crew was taught to keep turned away. The tank did not explode the way films show it. It brewed. There is a specific ugliness to how a Panther burns, and men who saw it up close never quite scrubbed it out. The side plate cracked. The propellant charges stacked inside the hull caught, and a jet of flame went straight up out of the open commander's hatch like a blowtorch stood on end. The gun, still trained east, still hunting a threat that was not east, sagged as the turret ring warped. Inside, the fight was already over. The men who could climb out climbed out burning. The commander of that first Panther never turned his head the right way. In the 90 seconds he had, his attention stayed locked forward and slightly left, toward the tree line where a professional expected trouble, toward the direction his gunnery tables told him to fear. The Hellcats were 90 degrees off that line, low, quiet under the engine noise of his own column. And by the time the flash registered in the corner of his vision, it was his own tank flashing. Now the platoon opened together. This is the part the German column could not process fast enough to survive. 4 Hellcats firing from a frontage no wider than a soccer pitch, each one laid on a pre-ranged slice of the same road, each one shooting into flank plate at a range where the 76 did not care about slope or hardness, or the reputation of German steel. A round that strikes 45 millimeters of vertical plate at 150 meters does not deflect. It goes through, and it takes the inside of the tank with it, the spall, the fuel lines, the ammunition racked along the hull sides, exactly where the American gunners were aiming. The German response was the response the situation demanded, and the terrain forbade. Traverse toward the threat. The second Panther in line began swinging its turret right, the hydraulic drive grinding the big casting around, at a pace built for deliberate long-range work, not for a knife fight that had already started. The turret was still moving when the round arrived. Smell reached the survivors before understanding did. Cordite, hot metal, and under it, the Swedish reek of burning diesel, and something worse that nobody in a memoir ever names directly. A German Panzer grenadier riding behind the column, interviewed in captivity weeks later, described the noise more than the sight. "It was not a battle," he said. "It was a series of explosions, one tank after another, and we could not see who was shooting." That is the whole thing in one sentence from a man who was there. We could not see who was shooting. The fog the brigade had treated as a blanket had become a screen the Americans fired from behind, and the muzzle flashes were low and brief and gone, swallowed before a German gunner could lay on them. The first cycle cost the column its lead tanks and something harder to replace, which was the belief that the machine underneath them was enough. A crew that has watched the tank ahead, brew up in 3 seconds, stops trusting the thick plate at the front. It starts looking sideways, into the gray, for the thing it cannot find. And the Hellcats were already moving. Before the second Panther finished falling still, the reverse slope pockets were emptying, drivers backing their thin-skinned mounts off the firing line to reappear somewhere the German gunners were not yet looking. The killing was not finished. It was relocating. 7 minutes past first light, and the second cycle begins from ground. The Germans have already written off as safe. The 2 lead Panthers are burning behind the crest, and the surviving commanders make the reasonable assumption that the guns which killed them are still sitting where they fired. They are not. Kritzberg's driver has already reversed 40 meters and swung the hull into a fold of ground 200 meters south. Engine never cut, transmission never cold. When the third Panther pushes past its dead companions to close the range on the tree line, it presents its flank to a gun that is no longer where its gunner thinks it is. The 76 fires again. This time, the round goes in below the turret ring on the left side, into the fighting compartment, and the Panther stops as though it has driven into a wall. The crew that had been looking for muzzle flashes near the trees was looking at the wrong horizon. The fourth tank died faster than any of them. Its commander, seeing the third brew, made the one decision that in every other fight of his career had saved his life. He ordered his gunner to swing onto the last known flash and fire. The Traverse motor began its slow grind. A Hellcat, 230 meters off his right rear, a machine that had repositioned during the first cycle and now sat idling in the fog with a clean line on his engine deck, fired into the rear plate where the fuel and the radial's German equivalent lived. The Panther's back end opened, and the fire took it whole. Second Panther of this cycle, fifth of the morning. The turret never finished its turn. 2 more tanks in 90 seconds. State it plainly, because the men inside them could not. There is a moment in a fight when a professional stops thinking about winning and starts thinking about the 20 seconds after now. And for Panzer-Brigade 11-3, that moment arrived across the radio net in a single word: Zurück, back, reverse. It was not in any plan. The brigade had crossed its start line that morning to attack, to drive west and cut the American advance, and now a company commander whose name the surviving logs do not record was screaming at his column to throw itself into reverse and claw backward out of a beat field it could not see across, away from guns it could not find, ordered by an enemy doctrine that said, "Armored aggression won battles." Zurück. The word carries something the interrogation reports circle without ever quite touching. It is the sound of a professional army being told by its own instincts that the machine underneath it, the thing it was promised, the 80 millimeters of sloped frontal plate that had bounced Allied fire across 2 years of war, did not matter here at all. The plate faced the wrong direction. There was no right direction. Every way a Panther turned, its flank went to somebody. A German tanker who lived through it put it flatly to his American interrogators, and the sentence sits in the file without decoration. We were told to go forward, and then we were told to go back, and going back was worse. Going back was worse. A tank reversing across broken ground is slow, blind out the rear, and it turns its thinnest plate and its hottest engine toward exactly the guns it is trying to escape. The Hellcats, built for 1 second of firing and 2 of vanishing, simply kept doing the arithmetic on a column that had stopped shooting back and started fleeing. The fog that had felt like a blanket at 4 a.m. held the smoke down low over the field, so the survivors reversed through the smell of their own brigade burning. Diesel, cordite, scorched paint still bright from the factory. 6 weeks earlier, those tanks had no mud on their road wheels. Now they were teaching a doctrine to men who would not live to write it down. What does a command do when it moves down a column of men who cannot see the thing killing them? It mutates. Kritzberg's platoon had killed 5 Panthers, and the word Zurück left the 3rd Company on the radio net as an order. But by the time it reached the 6th and 7th tanks back in the fog, it was not an order anymore. It was permission. Permission to do the thing every driver had already started doing with his hands before his commander said it out loud. The reverse command spread the way panic always spreads through a line, unevenly, and fastest at the back. The lead tanks could not run because they were burning and blocking the road they had come up. The tanks behind them could not go forward because forward was a wall of fire and the flank guns that made the fire. So the pressure went backward down the column, like a wave hitting a seawall and rolling back on itself. each driver hauling his sticks into reverse the instant he understood that staying still and pointing his gun into the gray had killed everyone who tried it. A Panther weighs 45 tons. It does not reverse gracefully across a wet beet field. It slews, it throws mud, it stalls, it grinds forward again, and the driver, blind out the back, feels for ground he cannot see, while the man beside him screams directions into an intercom that carries mostly engine noise. Stop on this. An entire armored advance, the whole reason Panzer-Brigade 11-3 existed that morning, went into reverse. The brigade had rolled out to attack. Its purpose was forward motion, the one thing a Panther column does better than almost anything on the field when it gets to choose the range and the ground. Now it was giving that up. Every tank that threw itself backward surrendered the initiative, the momentum, the entire point of being a tank in exchange for the chance to survive the next 60 seconds. The doctrine that had carried these men across 2 years of war said armored aggression won battles. The doctrine had no line for what to do when aggression only fed you into the guns faster, and reversing did not save them. That was the cruelty of the geometry. A tank going backward is slower than a tank going forward, and it points its weakest plate and its hottest engine deck at whatever it is fleeing from. The Hellcats had been built for exactly this arithmetic. 1 second to fire, 2 to move, sitting warm in the fog with clean lines on the rear plates of tanks that were now conveniently turning those plates toward them. The column did not escape the ambush by reversing. It fed the ambush its back. A German officer captured that week described the sensation to his interrogators, and the file records it without comment. There was no direction that was safe. We reversed, and the vehicles behind us were also reversing, and we could not move. Read that again. They could not move. The reverse command, meant to save the column, jammed it. Tanks backing into tanks, drivers unable to see, the road behind clogged with the same machines, all trying to occupy the same retreat at once, while the guns in the fog kept their steady rhythm of fire and relocate. The order to run had produced a traffic jam under fire. There is no worse place for a tank to be than stationary, broadside, and surrounded by other stationary tanks, and that is precisely what the escape attempt created. The 19-year-old in his 4th week, if he was still alive by this point, was now doing the one thing his 4 weeks of training had least prepared him for. Going backward, blind, into his own column, away from an enemy he had never once seen. The factory paint was blistering off the engine louvers. The advance that came to cut the American line was cutting nothing now, only trying and failing to turn around. A single sheet in the operations file of Panzer-Brigade 11-3 logs the morning's result in the flat handwriting of a staff officer who was not there to see it. The column that crossed its start line to cut the American advance west of Besançon-la-Grande recorded its lead company destroyed and the attack timetable broken before it had covered the first 2 kilometers of its axis. The paper does not describe fire. It describes schedule. That is the thing that should sit heaviest. The document that survives is not a battle account. It is a timetable that stopped. By full light, the beet field held the wrecks the American gunners had made of the morning, and the smell had settled into the low ground and would not lift. Diesel that had burned and gone out and started again on a fresh fuel line. Rubber road wheels cooking off the hubs. Beneath it the other smell, the one the Panzer Grenadier in captivity would not name, and the interrogator did not press him on. A man walking that field an hour later breathed it before he saw a single hull. The German after-action reporting circles the event, the way men circle a thing they cannot afford to look at directly. Officers who filed on the Lorraine fighting that September wrote of American anti-tank guns appearing on flanks that had been scouted clear, of columns rerouted, of attacks called off because the ground could not be crossed. Their word, recurring through the interrogation summaries, is not defeat, it is hesitation. The professionals who had written the manual on armored aggression began, in their own reports, to describe themselves waiting. Waiting is the confession. An army built to move first and fast was now recording, in its own hand, that it had stopped to look before it advanced. The counter-offensive that Panzer-Brigade 11-3 belonged to lost its timetable in fields like this one, and the timetable was the whole weapon. A pincer that arrives late is not a pincer. The armored punch that was supposed to reach the American flank while it was still soft arrived, where it arrived at all, into positions that had hardened and gun lines that had ranged them. The Hellcats had not just killed tanks, they had spent the German clock, and the clock did not refill. Think about what that costs a professional to write down. These were the men who had taken France in 6 weeks in 1940, who had made the word blitzkrieg mean something the rest of the world had to learn in a hurry. 4 years later, their after-action files record columns that would not cross open ground, commanders who rerouted rather than push, an offensive whose momentum bled out in ambushes it never saw coming. The enemy testified to the Hellcat more honestly than any American citation could, because the enemy had no reason to flatter it, and every reason to explain the failure some other way. They did not explain it some other way. They wrote that they could not see who was shooting, that there was no direction that was safe, that going back was worse than going forward. That is the case, closed by the men who lost. The 19-year-old in his 4th week does not appear in the file by name. The staff officer counted hulls, not boys. Whether he climbed out of his Panther or stayed in it, the paper does not say, and the records that might have said were themselves burning in other fields that same autumn. His name is not recorded. What is recorded is the machine he was promised, the 80 millimeters of sloped plate, sitting in a beat field with its flank opened and its gun still pointed at a threat that was never there. The Hellcat crews did not know most of this. They knew they had killed a column and moved before it could answer. The rest of it, the broken schedule, the rerouted attacks, the word hesitation entering a German report, came out later, in files translated and read by men in offices, long after the fog over Besange-la-Grande had burned off and taken the smell with it. What happens to a reflex after the thing that caused it is gone? Panzer-Brigade 11. 3 ceased to exist as a fighting formation within days. The Lorraine tank battles that historians would later file under the name Arracourt ground on through the second half of September 1944, and by the end of them, the 5th Panzer Army had lost the better part of 2 Panzer brigades to American armor and tank destroyers that they consistently outnumbered and consistently could not beat. The machines burned in the beat fields. The men who could walk went into American cages or back east to be rebuilt into new units with new numbers. But the order lived. That is the strange part. German tankers who survived Lorraine carried west with them a lesson their doctrine had no page for, and it showed up in the way they fought afterward. Officers filing for the American Historical Division after the war, the Foreign Military Studies series, described the same reflex hardening across the autumn front, crews that stopped at the edge of open ground, commanders who declined to advance across fields, their maps called clear, columns that reversed on the first flanking round rather than push through it. Von Mellenthin, who watched the Lorraine fighting from the German staff, wrote that the tank battles there went against the Panzers in ways the numbers alone did not explain. His numbers favored the Germans, the ground did not. The Panther was, on paper, the better tank. State that plainly, because it was true. Its gun outranged the Hellcat 76. Its frontal armor shrugged off rounds the Hellcat could only pray to place, and in a straight fight at a range the German picked, the American machine lost and lost badly. Every crew in that column knew it. None of it mattered, and the Americans had built their whole argument around that. The Hellcat did not fight the fight the Panther was built to win. It fought the one the Panther could not, fast, blind, at knife range and fog, firing from the one direction the sloped plate did not face, then gone before the traverse motor finished its grind. American industry had built 500 and something meters per minute of road speed into a tank destroyer, specifically so it would never have to survive the German gun. It only had to be somewhere else when that gun came around. When the enemy's trained instinct told him to reverse, that was the proof it had worked. That reflex is worth looking at squarely. It was the German army, the authors of maneuver warfare, being taught by a cheaper machine that maneuver had changed hands. The reversing Panther was not a coward's tank. It was a professional's tank, driven by a man doing the mathematically correct thing, which was to get his weak plate away from guns he could not locate, in a retreat that fed him to those same guns anyway. The doctrine of aggression had been turned inside out and handed back to its inventors, and they recognized it, and they wrote it down, and they still could not fix it before the war ended. A captured tank commander, asked by his interrogators what he would have done differently that morning at Arracourt, gave the answer that closes the file better than any American after-action report ever could. Nothing. We did everything the way we were taught. The Americans simply did not fight the way we were taught they would. He said it without heat, the way a man describes weather. Then, according to the interrogator's note, he asked whether there was any coffee, because he had not eaten since the day before the attack, and the guns had started before breakfast.